Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Has going back to school become the political football of this season? Let's get to the bottom line. The new academic year is off to a chaotic start for America's 50 million students and their families. In many schools that open for face-to-face learning, some students or teachers have already tested positive for coronavirus, leading to quarantines and temporary shutdowns within days. With vague and conflicting guidance from public officials, each of these school districts has had to come up with its own guidelines. Think about that for a second. In a country with more than 13,000 separate school districts, each one is out there figuring this out all out on its own. And that's on top of President Trump breathing down their necks with repeated tweets like this one. Well, today we're fortunate to be talking about these issues with someone who has worked with schools and teachers all her life and has been a high school teacher herself. Randi Weingarten is president of the American Federation of Teachers, one of the largest labor unions in America, representing more than 1.6 million teachers and school employees. Randi, thanks for joining us. I guess I just want to ask you for the moment, did you ever think that schools would become the political battleground that they have right before both party conventions are starting in this country?
Well, schools and teachers and teacher unions and financing of schools have become political footballs for years. I remember candidates like Alphonse D'Amato when he was in trouble trying to pit parents against teachers using tenure. I remember even Bob Dole, saying we're not going to be controlled by teacher unions at a Republican convention. So I'm not surprised that Trump and DeVos would use, would try to pit teachers against parents. It doesn't actually ever work. But this is what I'm really surprised about. The reckless disregard of health and safety and using children and teachers in a political game, creating the level of fear and uncertainty. That is really new, and that I have not seen in modern history any government ever attempt to do. It is reckless disregard and deprivation of children's lives. That's what Trump and DeVos have done here.
Now, you made a statement recently that we cared more about the process of reopening our bars than we did about reopening the schools, and asked about what price we're putting on the safety of teachers, on the safety of children. But you're not opposed to reopening. The AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, has issued a set of guidelines. Could you tell them about us? Tell us about them?
Sure. I mean, the reason I said that a few weeks ago is because if you looked at any of the original reopening plans, particularly the ones coming out of the White House, the first thing they wanted to reopen were bars and restaurants. I mean, in fact, they're trying to figure out how to revive a tax deduction for wealthy people for taking people out for business lunches and dinners, as opposed to thinking about what is the most important thing we can do after keeping people healthy and safe and protecting our hospitals and our nurses and our first responders. It's how would you reopen schools safely to create confidence that this fall reopening of schools and colleges were done really, we're done with a way of dedication and fidelity towards children's needs. And that's what was so shocking, that it felt like it was an afterthought. It felt like it was, it's August or it's July. Oh, schools are supposed to open in August and September. Well, maybe we should think about that a little bit. And it just felt like it wasn't a priority. And then when they actually started talking in all caps tweet, you must reopen schools. It just was so shocking, the lack of regard to the science or the complexity of what that actually meant. It felt like, kids just didn't mean anything to, the politics meant something to Trump, not kids. Our thought was we needed to reopen schools in a less haphazard and chaotic way than they were closed. And since we weren't getting any guidance from the CDC at that point or from HHS, and certainly not from the Department of Education, we started on our own talking to epidemiologists and virologists and infectious disease docs and pediatricians and people like Donna Shalala and Andy Slavic and others who had actually done this work, and then infused that with the work of our own members who were on the ground as healthcare practitioners or educators. And we came up with a plan about how to reopen schools safely. And I think our plan, which we published on April 29th, was the first one out there of any consequence. Indeed, the CDC's first guidance came out about 5 weeks later, and the science that we relied on in our plan was the same as their science, which, I was comforted by, because it did feel like there was a circumference of readily accessible scientific guidelines that you needed to follow in order to reopen any indoor anything, and particularly to reopen schools. And I can go through what that guidance was and is. It is as important today as it was in April. And I remind people that we did it at the time that the virus was still rising in places like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. Our view was you needed plenty of time to create a new normal in order to assure children and educator and community safety. And that's why we went through, really focused on the science, and then focused on children's well-being and children's instructional needs.
Well, you were listening to science, you were listening to experts, and I've got a bit of a clip from Idaho State Senator Stephen Fain on listening to experts. Would love to get your reaction.
What's happening is we're having a standardized approach by people saying that we need to listen to the experts. Listening to experts to set policy is an elitist approach. And I'm very fearful of an elitist approach. I'm also fearful that it leads to totalitarianism, especially when you say, well, we're doing it for the public good. Well, America was founded on the idea that people weighed their own risks. They did what they thought was best for their own interests.
Well, your thoughts?
I don't actually understand how he could be in education and say this. Meaning, education is based upon a set of principles that you actually have to learn. There's a difference between fact and fiction. You can actually, believe what you want to believe, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. And the question I would have for him, and, I understand this, I'm a social studies teacher. We often teach about the tensions in America between the social compact and rugged individualism. But with all due respect, the Constitution, as well as the Declaration of Independence, was about how we ceded some of our individual freedom and power to have real long-term freedom. So so essentially what he's doing is just putting people in harm's way by not thinking about the public good and by not thinking about the science. And it saddens me, but this is a direct response to the fact that the current president of the United States has been a huge denier about about COVID and about the science that underlies it, and about what we need to do to actually make sure that people are safe and healthy. And if we do that, and if we contain the disease, then we can actually deal with the economic implications. I'm glad I don't live in the jurisdiction in which he presides.
There's been a lot of blame that has been perhaps unfairly directed at teachers in this, but you're in every community. Why are the divides so great?
So COVID has actually So if you think about the last several months, it has exposed the inequality in America and in some ways made it much worse. There's the great thing about America is that going back to Jefferson, and again, sorry, I am a social studies teacher, but going back to Jefferson, even though public education was not baked into the United States Constitution, it has been baked into every state's constitution and every territory's constitution, including Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia. And it is a sense that public education gives us or levels the playing field to create opportunity for all. It doesn't always happen, and money really does matter. There's lots of studies that say that wealth actually dictates more of outcomes than almost anything else. But public education can be the way to level the playing field. What we've learned pre-COVID in the last few years is that if we really do focus on well-being and making sure that kids have a safe and welcoming place, a school, and then use the roots of engagement and well-being to create powerful instruction and make sure that teachers are really prepared, particularly in lots of different ways of teaching, and are culturally competent to deal with to deal with the broad breadth of diversity and inclusion that we need to do, and that we really involve community and have the leadership and the resources we need, then you can pretty much turn around virtually every outcome for kids to the better. And so that's where community schools come in, because they provide some of the wraparound services you need to really meet the needs of kids. What has happened with COVID is that there's been a huge recognition by parents. We just saw it in the new Gallup poll that public schooling is really important. Parents have been really grateful about the engagement, as imperfect as it was, and remote is really imperfect, and we don't have enough, we have a huge digital divide, and we don't have enough connectivity and computers for the kids that we need to make sure that we give it to, and on and on. But my point is that the connection that teachers had with kids, the way to kind of calm kids down and calm parents down during some of the heights of COVID in March and April and May, when people had no idea what it was or what it meant or how viral and how deadly it could be. That was huge. The other thing that's huge is that teaching is an art and a science. You don't just get up one morning and say you can be a great teacher. It takes practice. It takes a lot of tools. And parents, as they were homeschooling, saw that over and over again. I believe, Steve, that if we tackle the virus, then there are things that we can do. And frankly, Joe Biden has a good plan about this, tripling Title I, or basically, tripling the federal resources that are needed for the kids who are most at risk. And so if we actually can tackle the virus and start some in-school learning so that we actually start engagement with kids again in person, so we really decrease the social isolation and we recreate communities with them, and then we wrap services around, then over the course of those next few months to a year, we can rapidly erase some of the learning loss and rapidly erase some of the agita and stress that kids have and parents now have about kids' learning loss. But you have to tackle the virus first. You can't actually have situations like in Florida where you open, kids are not wearing masks, teachers are not wearing masks. The school system is like the guy you showed
Right.
earlier. And then all of a sudden, 1,000 people are on quarantine. There's an in and out. There's an uncertainty about that. So we have to tackle the virus first, and then and start in many places as a default with remote education, where we make sure that teachers and kids are connected to each other, and then we can overcome some of the inequities. But the inequities are vast. There's a disproportionate number of the essential workers who are Black and brown. There's a disproportionate number of people who've gotten sick who are Black and brown. There's a disproportionate number of people who are unemployed who are Black and brown. There's a disproportionate number of people who need childcare that are Black and brown. So the inequities have been stark and exposed, but it also shows that if we can actually target resources to the school districts and people who need it most, we can actually really reboot after we tackle the disease. And I'm actually very optimistic that if Biden and Harris get into leadership, that we have a Senate who will actually give us the funding that we need so that people are not buying their own PPE, that we can actually erase the loss right now, and we can actually restart in a way that people will say, we got through COVID, we're pretty resilient, let's actually get to teaching and learning and building community again.
Randi, you just said something so important that many people may not realize, which is that teachers often buy their own supplies, or they work with their communities and teachers to sort of pool when there's, because they don't have enough money to teach. You just said they're now buying their own PPE, their own personal protective equipment. And
yeah,
I'd love to just give people a real
We're sending these masks to everyone. We're sending our
branded
masks to everyone.
AFT mask.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to underscore something that I always found remarkable when I heard it, is that many of these teachers that are already low salary to begin with, for whom you're advocating, are out there using their own funds to educate these kids. Can you just give our both domestic American audience, our international audience, a kind of, pipeline into understanding what those stresses and tensions and costs for teachers are?
So, and it is one of the most, I don't actually quite understand how in America teachers can be so revered and disrespected at the same time. And what I mean by that is that people just thought, well, teachers will figure it out. Well, teachers are superhuman beings. Well, teachers will go to school. Well, it doesn't matter that we don't provide any materials or equipment for them. They'll subsidize what they need to subsidize. They'll just figure it out. And so there's that underlying sense that we can figure out anything, and that we will subsidize our children's education and we will subsidize our classrooms. We're the only, quote, business that actually has to subsidize what we do in terms of our equipment and our supplies, and it's expected. And I think that the issue is that right now we don't have the scientific background. We don't have the wherewithal. We are not the leaders that are fighting the virus. And what do I mean by us subsidizing normally? Teachers put out of their pocket. So the average teacher probably makes $35,000, $40,000, $50,000 now. We take out of our pocket on average at least $1,000 to subsidize our classes. Every teacher I know has a story like the stories that I have, which is, buying books for our kids, buying review books for our kids. I will never forget one day, one of my kids who was really, 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 really proud, I would just leave a review book, a Barron's review book, just in her locker or her mailbox. And for a long time, she would not know who was leaving it there. And when she graduated, she said to me, "Were you the person who left it there?" I'm like, yeah. But I wouldn't tell her beforehand because I didn't want her to return it. I didn't want her to feel, that pride of no, I can figure it out myself. And that's what teachers do all the time. But who has the money to do sanitizing your own room, to have your own PPE for yourself and for your students? How is that our job? And the fact that there's no respect for it, like the fact that the president And the head of the Senate, McConnell, refused to actually negotiate with Schumer and Pelosi over school
Right.
funds. And it's just another example of the disrespect
Right.
of not only educators, of the children we serve.
Randy, as we head into this school season now, are things better off or worse off?
It's actually just gotten worse, not better, because of the
Yeah.
denials and the lack of truth and the credibility issues. We have a short term disaster that is not going to get better unless we have new national leadership. If we have new national leadership, it will get better because you can see the resilience on a local level will enable us to not lose this year and really kind of reopen schools. But right now, it's a disaster.
Randy, just in the last couple of minutes here, just to get a quick snapshot, and really appreciate your candor in all of this. We see attacks today on the Postal Service. That's a basic core institution in the country. We see a lot of our norms and the infrastructure in the country under stress and duress. We see rights of people that are fragile today. Do you worry that the American public school system is in danger at this point of being squashed as well, that it is much more fragile than anyone thinks in this time?
Mm-hmm. So I worry that if we don't have a democracy, we will not have an America. As imperfect as American democracy is, and it's a through line, Steve, through this whole conversation. There are several things in America that try to ensure that everyone has an opportunity for power. One is public education. Another is voting. Another is being able to be part of a union so that you can actually negotiate the terms and conditions with your boss. But what you're seeing here with the post office is that a piece of what was in our first Constitution, how to ensure that people actually can communicate with each other through a letter that gets sent from one to another, which is as important today as it was back in the 1700s because of what happened with COVID, and as important in rural areas as it is in urban areas. The fact that you have a president that thinks it's okay to undermine a national election, to undermine the post office, to undermine any of the norms of democracy in furtherance of only one thing, his reelection. That is a huge 5-alarm fire in the United States, because as we know from history, we don't actually get a do-over after autocracy starts. So ultimately, I have been really encouraged by the fact that throughout America, when people saw those post office boxes being taken away, they said, no, this is ours. This is our post office. And ultimately, it's going to be people in America over these next 80 days that become the check and balance for making sure we can have a free and fair election, including the norms of our democracy, again, as imperfect as they've been, like public education, like voting, like the post office, are actually intact through November.
Well, with that, Randi Weingarten, thank you so much for your insights and your candor.
Thank you.
We'll see how this plays out in the conventions, and we wish you all very well. Randi Weingarten, President of the American Federation of Teachers. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, very much.
So what's the bottom line? Parents don't need or want school reopenings to be a political tool used by the left or the right. They just want their kids to be safe and to get the best education they can under the circumstances. As Randi Weingarten said today, there are ways to reopen, but they take dollars and political will to invest in our children and our future. That political will is hiding out somewhere. It's missing in action, nowhere to be seen. And America, which has always been king of the hill on education, is now kicking down its own hill. And that's the bottom line.